I could start by making some announcements. I want to make a shameless plug to get any of those in this room or folks in your organizations that are working at the intersection of technology and voter participation to apply to our Tech and Democracy Fellowship. This is a non-resident fellowship here at the Ash Center, and we're looking for thought partners that are working in the space of voter participation. So I encourage you to apply, and I'll leave some leaflets at the registration table. I also want to give a few thank yous for this day. The Ash Center team, thank you so much to Sarah, Melissa, Julianne, Dan, Natalia, Tim, Cecily, and Ashley for all of your help. I have more thank yous. More thank yous to our partners at the Shorenstein Center, Nico and Tim, and our partners at the Institute of Politics, Mark, Amy, and Christian. You can. Of course, thank you to the participants that came. This is one of many conversations that we hope to continue. And of course, a big thank you to the students that have been very, very helpful along this whole process. Last but not least, thank you to the HUD staff for their hospitality, IT services for making things work. And last but not least, we have evaluations that should be in front of you. We kindly ask that you fill it out and drop it off in the box on your way out. Or, actually you're not leaving because we're going to try to keep you for a reception that's going to follow in this discussion. And that's about it for announcements. And I'm going to turn it over to HKS Professor Catherine Sissy. Thank you.
Wait, first, I want to echo Teresa's thank yous to all. Echo her thank yous to all the presenters to all the presenters. There we go. All the presenters and the participants. I think we've had some amazing presentations and discussion in this. And certainly the breakout groups that I was a part of were, very, very informative. And so this last session, the purpose is we've invited one person back from each of the breakout groups, and they're going to kind of report back to us. And each person is only going to be given about 5 minutes, and so it's a very demanding task, but then we'll have time for a discussion with the rest of the group here about kind of common themes or concerns or issues that have been emerging. And so first I just wanted to say that we have each of the breakout sessions was given a report back worksheet guide, and they were asked 7 questions in this guide. Now it's too much for each person to report back on 7 questions in 5 minutes, but I wanted to just let you know what are the questions that they were asked to think about. The first was, what are the 2-3 biggest opportunities in this area? Second, for these possibilities, what would winning look like in 5 to 10 years? So again, this is longer time horizon that many of you have been talking about. Who would have to be on board in order to make this happen? What are the most important next steps in making this happen? What are the immediate, short-term follow-up steps to be taken? What have been the challenges and failures in this area? And finally, what are the best examples that are currently or have been used? And so I'm going to just ask the presenters maybe to focus on a couple of the issues that your session dedicated most of its attention to. And we're going to go in order of the breakout sessions as they appear in the program and the agenda, so you kind of know where we're at. So we're going to start with Ashley Spillane, who is going to talk about the Creating a Culture Shift breakout session. Then we're going to turn to David Becker, who's going to speak about mobilizing non-voters breakout session. Wendy Underhill is going to talk about states at the cutting edge. John Della Volpe, who's going to discuss the Young Americans of Participation. Anjali Fernandez is going to discuss the technology and social media breakout session. And finally, Saju Bojwani is going to discuss the universal registration and universal voting. So I want to thank everyone very much who agreed to do this. It's difficult, we know, and we're going to pass the word first to Ashley.
Exciting. Good afternoon, everybody. So we had a very robust discussion in the room that was catalyzed by conversations our panelists started. We have Nupur from MTV, Lisa from Patagonia, Stevie from Chicago Votes, formerly led National Voter Registration Day, and Gara LaMarche from Democracy Alliance. And what we heard from them and what we talked about in the room was that in reality, we don't know what works in terms of messaging, in terms of changing the culture to get people who do not vote right now into a place of wanting to participate. But in the sense that there are no silver bullets that are going to work across all of the communities that we organize in, and that it would be really helpful to make sure that we're anchoring our work in conversations with the people who aren't showing up right now to understand what they are going to need to hear and what they want to, what will sort of motivate them. Some folks in the room raised challenges around the lack of patience that young people have for change. I pointed out that there's this great quote about the impatience of youth and that Socrates brought up, a few years ago. So it's sort of a constant theme that young people are always looking for fast solutions. But I think that that's something that's going to actually really have to be addressed because we don't have a system of government that's moving progress forward very quickly. And we have election cycle after election cycle. We tell people it's the most important election of their lifetime. And then we tell them that the person they're electing is their savior and will fix all of their problems. And then, unsurprisingly, they're disappointed. So figuring out a way to be more authentic in our communications and getting real with people about what the actual repercussions of their vote will be is important. The other thing that we talked about is as a challenge is the fact that at our best, we talk to people every 2 years. At our worst, it's every 4 years. And so we're not bringing a full sense and scope of what active citizenship is in this country. And so we go, let's say 2 years, and we say, hey, you got to show up and vote. It really matters. And then we don't keep them engaged, these voters that we talk to engaged to make sure that they understand how to hold the elected officials accountable, how to appreciate small victories, how to acknowledge failure and figure out ways to do it better for next time. And then we instead just show up 2 or 4 years later and say, hey, do it again. Don't worry about what we said last time. So that's on the challenges side. On the opportunity side, we had some great folks who do corporate work that work in the corporate world, and I think they model some really excellent behavior at Patagonia. We talked about the fact that Lisa and her team, the whole company's commitment is to speak authentically and with a mission and with purpose, and so there's no question about where they stand on things, and the consumer understands that if they're not values aligned, Patagonia's okay with that and willing to lose a consumer, which I think is not exactly where a lot of corporations are, but has worked very well for them on their engagement. And just for anyone that wasn't in the room, we talked a little bit about what they had done in 2016 in terms of communicating regularly with their consumers about the fact that being interested in the environment means that you should be an activist. They treat their customers like activists, and that voting is a core part of that activism. And then they shut all the stores down in 2016 and sent people out to vote. We also talked about MTV's model. They've had years and years, 27 years ago, helped found Rock the Vote and launched Rock the Vote. They have a long history of civic engagement and participation. Last year, they brought back Total Request Live as Total Registration Live. They've done a lot of content integration, trying to make sure that they're weaving seamlessly the narrative into scripts that it's important to participate and things like that. And then Stevie talked a lot about the programs that he's running in Chicago
and did on National Voter Registration Day, of tying policy, and Gara mentioned the importance of this too, tying policy to voting. So really connecting with people about the issues that matter to them, not the issues that matter to us, and making sure that they understand sort of where the we're going on is. I think the biggest challenges and what are also the biggest opportunities to take away from this are that we need long-term organizing investment, both investment in the communities that people are organizing for get out the vote in. There needs to be funding, there needs to be infrastructure, and there needs to be support so that there's ongoing communication with these constituencies. We need to get part of that. In order to do that, there needs to be culture change amongst funders, a real shift in that culture of understanding that it's not cycle to cycle based. I know that I've been working in this world for 15 years. That's never changed. And that area comes up all the time. So just want to elevate that. But I wish Gara very much luck changing that culture. And then the other thing is to actually make it fun. Like, we talk with each other a lot. We sort of get very serious about all of this. But the more we can make these activities communal, Victoria from Tumblr was talking about, should we take our online activations offline? I was laughing and thinking, of course, that's such a good idea, because if you don't ever do anything offline, you don't have great pictures to post online. So like, give people the opportunity. So making it more fun and giving people opportunities to engage community-wise too. And I think that's everything.
Thanks for setting a great model here, and we're going to turn to David Becker with Mobilizing Non-Voters.
Thanks. So it's probably impossible in 5 minutes to communicate how rich the conversation was and how much everyone in the room was really engaged as we were talking. I think a lot of it had to do with the great panel we had. Christine Chen, Andrea Haley, Daniel Garza, and Kayla Reed all shared their experiences in doing outreach to diverse communities and what they'd seen over their years of work. I think I'm going to start with where we ended, which was a great question at the end that came from Professor Kezar, which said, if there's all this great work being done, and it's so easy to vote in so many places, which is true, it's easier to vote in almost every place in the United States than ever has been before, why is turnout still going down? And that really gets at the core of what we're all here talking about today. And so as we were discussing this, there were several challenges, and which are also opportunities that came up consistently, and I'm struck by how much they're similar to what you discussed, Ashley. First, one of the things that we've seen is that low propensity voters are often ignored in between at each election cycle. There's pretty good reason for that. I mean, campaigns and others are trying to maximize their return on investment, the bang for their buck with voters, and voters who are historically low propensity are not where that bang for the buck's going to be. But it's a vicious cycle that perpetuates itself that we can't really get out of, that if they're never engaged with, how are they ever going to be engaged in the first place? This is something Ashley brought up, and it's absolutely true. The funding in this space is always episodic, and always, if we fund this work every September of an even numbered year, we're never going to see a long-term impact that we want to see. And this was something many people brought up and discussed. That we really need to change that dynamic and get something that's more 365 days a year, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. This was identified, and I thought this was interesting. So much of the money that goes into outreach to get people to turn out actually ends up in the hands of consultant class, largely based in DC, not particularly diverse, and it doesn't actually filter down all the way to the outreach level. This is a point Andrea raised really well, I think, and I think it's absolutely right. One of the other things we discussed is that we often make assumptions about certain demographic groups, whether it's age or race or ethnicity, and what their partisan implications might be. And I think all of us have to take a step back and ask ourselves, are we in this work to achieve a partisan outcome, or are we in this work actually just to help strengthen democracy by getting more people participating. And we also have to recognize that the demographic groups that we're talking about are much more heterogeneous and diverse within themselves than we often give them credit for. All college students don't vote Democrat. That might come as a surprise to people, but it's true. And so that will require a much more robust and diverse set of responses to engage these voters, because we're not trying to engage them for one election to inflame their passions to vote because they think something bad or good will happen if they vote a particular way or if they don't vote. We really, in order to achieve the goal that we're talking about here today, we need to turn people not into Obama voters or not into marijuana legalization voters. As I said in the room, you can only put marijuana on the ballot once. But we want to turn them to voters. We want them voting every time. This is a huge challenge. We want them voting even when their vote's likely not going to make a difference in the outcome, like all of us in this room do. And that's going to be a challenge that require constant engagement. One of the challenges we identified, and it's an area that we identified as ripe for further research, and something I and others have done some work on, which is that people feel disconnected from government. They don't really understand how their vote or the people that they might vote for or against impact their daily lives. That is a really bad sign. All right. So figuring out how to somehow understand better. How to understand better the connection people make between government and their daily lives and the act of voting, which we don't have a really good handle on it right now. So certain tactics were identified that I think are important here. First, encouraging campaigns, candidates, and others to go after those low propensity voters, to find ways to incentivize them going after low propensity voters, even though the return on investment might be not quite as great. But the long-term investment over time might be significant. Secondly, holding schools and universities accountable for the participation rates of their students. I know there are a lot of people in the room who are doing outstanding work on that. There were a lot of people in the session who were as well. And then lastly, something I'm particularly passionate about is leveraging the power of government. Government already reaches out to all voters in every election. That's what they do. And figuring out ways that can be done more effectively. And many of the government officials who are here today are great examples of that. We're constantly thinking about ways that they can better connect with their voters and provide them with tools. So figuring that out is a key aspect of the work. So I think that's about it. I'll leave it at that.
So Wendy Underhill from the Breakout Group on States at the Cutting Edge.
Well, I don't know about everybody else, but I had a great time in our session. I just thought, I would see somebody in the back rocking for our session, so thank you. It was good because we had Jen Choate from Colorado on this panel, and it was good because we had Senator Hunt from Washington on the panel, and Senator Walker from Indiana, and Secretary of State Simon from Minnesota, and I don't see Secretary Gorbea in the room at this moment, but she's dynamite at any time. All right, so we're missing out on her. I'll try to represent her as well. So I'm a list maker. I've got 2 lists for you. I'm going to talk fast. If anybody if you want me to slow down, tell me. We've got the challenges and we've got the solutions. On the challenge side, it was pointed out that the government in the United States and election administration in the United States are balkanized, really complicated systems, hard for people to understand. How can you explain it in a heartbeat why you're voting sometimes in the spring and sometimes in November? So that's a challenge. I don't know what to do about it. We had different views on who's responsible for encouraging people to vote. There are people who think that it is the responsibility of government to encourage people to vote, and that might include everyone in the room. No, not everyone in the room, most of the people in the room. There are lots of other people who say that the role of government is to run good elections and that it's up to parties or others to get out the vote. And that would be Canada, and that would be a certain number of local election officials here in the United States. They literally don't see it as their job as part of government to do that. We also had a show me attitude. And this came in two flavors. There was the show me attitude about is there voter fraud and issues on that integrity side. And there was the show me attitude about you say that online voter registration, pre-registration, automatic registration, these are, automated registration. I was listening this morning. I'm trying to change my vocabulary on this. So do these things really change the outcome? And I know it's hard to do good empirical research on turnout because there's so many factors, including the weather and the candidates, but legislators and other policymakers need to have real data to make the move if on any of these things. And then, not surprisingly, partisanship came up in our conversation. We had a number of examples this morning of either bipartisan efforts or efforts led by Republicans, but in general there was the sense that Republicans are standing in the way of voter participation. I, of course, from the National Conference of State Legislatures disagree with that perspective. We have as many questions coming from Republicans on this as we do from Democrats. So I think that's an old narrative and one that would be, this is me speaking, not my panel speaking, would be good to kind of ditch that theory. And last we have more people identifying as independents than as Democrats or Republicans. That's not a problem, it's just to change how we respond to that is the question. Okay, I know I'm gonna run short here. Solutions, ideas, good things we can go forward with. Registration, we're all over that. The states that we have represented are doing several things, I've already mentioned them, to make registration easier. Happy to talk to anybody about those offline. Early voting options, or in fact having a menu of options for how to vote came up, and again, I'm happy to talk with anybody about what's going on around the nation on that front. But I was struck that there were 3 different examples of how to use high schools or colleges to improve voter participation, and one of those was awards for high schools that do a really good job at getting people registered. And another was to have competitions between colleges who can do the best job on that. And then last was to actually use your real live voting machines in polls for high schools. So if you're gonna vote on your high school, what is it called, student council, do it on the real equipment with real ballots, not just a mock election with something that you printed up or elsewhere. We also heard about a Voting Rights Act that was enacted this year in Washington State. It's only the 2nd state to have its own personal Voting Rights Act, an idea others can take home. Voter information is really important in terms of whether it's understandable, not just written in English that is okay for your PhD folks to read, but is it understandable by people who read at a 3rd grade level, and by people who, like probably half the people in the room, are almost used to wandering through life working with icons. We don't really read the instructions anymore. Do our ballots and our ballot information represent that? Then we had 3 ideas for contacting other people outside the election administration world that could help. And one is to work with your academics. How many people are academics in this room? Okay, so we had some interest in what can you do to make election administration work well. And again, what that might be a conversation to have over the drinks that come later. And in the state of Colorado, they're using GIS to find out where the non-registered eligible voters live. And they are literally knocking on the doors of those people. Now, I think that's pretty unusual for the government to be paying for that to happen, but if GIS can work for the Secretary of State's office in Colorado, GIS could work for anyone else who's interested in mobilizing voters. And then we heard that perhaps credit unions or utilities could put notices out, or when people ask for a change of address for credit union or utilities kinds of things, could they say back to them, while you're doing this, would you like to change your voter registration to your new address? That's pretty novel. And there's only one more point I want to make, and then if anybody from my panel wants to shout something out, that's certainly fine by me. And that last is that money matters. I heard it in our panel, I heard it in the panel on the change generation, and I've heard it now from the 2 people who spoke before, so I don't know where all that money's going to come from, but money matters. Anything else from my panel? Did I miss a key point? That's it for me.
Okay, John, from the technology and from the Young American. I was at it. Young American participation.
The change generation, yes, and I was lucky to facilitate a conversation with Ian Simmons from Blue Haven Initiative and all the great work he's doing, especially with Nancy at Tufts, with Charlene from Black Youth Project 100 and Sarah from the Alliance for Youth Action. And just the one piece of kind of breaking news from our panel is we are in the process at the IOB of publicizing our 35th poll. And the good news for those of you who weren't in our session is we're picking up the highest level of interest in midterm voting since the beginning of this poll. That we saw at this time in 2014, for perspective, which is why I think this conversation is so important to continue this. 4 years ago in 2014, 23% indicated that they would definitely vote. There'll be a drop-off, and now, as of a couple weeks ago, it's 37%. From 23 to 37%. In 2010, midterms, the last wave election, we had 31%. So, and that and every other measure of kind of political engagement is rising. And I think kind of we're on the potential verge of what we're seeing is a potential once in a generation shift. We saw something which shifted 15 points pre and post 9/11 in terms of the efficacy of voting and participation and the tangible effects of the political process. Before 9/11 and after 9/11, 15-point shift. We saw a very similar 16-point shift pre and post the 2016 presidential campaign. So I think young people in the 18 to 29-year-old cohort are ready for this conversation and ready to be empowered. In terms of the 2 to 3 kind of biggest opportunities in this area, civic education in colleges, I think we're starting to see a lot of similarities, I think, in themes kind of throughout each of the breakouts. But civic education in colleges, but also in high schools. And Margaret talked about the lack of civic education in Massachusetts, but beyond civic education, it's like hands-on civic education. Is kind of one, and we've seen that too in a lot of our research. The degree to which someone even engages with a local member of the school committee or city council has driven up participation in some of our earlier work. One, and then remembering that the youth vote extends beyond the college campus, and there are more young people outside of college campuses and inside college campuses. And I think it wasn't even from our session, it was another session that when Nancy talked about, I think 85% of those on college campus, in college, are in their home states. So really kind of understanding kind of the demographics and kind of the backgrounds of this cohort, by making sure that we expand to kind of the broader communities, college campuses, community colleges, and certainly other groups in rural and urban America. In addition to that, in terms of what we need to do to make sure that this happens, I was excited when we talked about some of the best examples in the past, whether it's increasing the vote by threefold in a local election in San Antonio, to some great work that's happening in COP 3 to 9 still, right? There's some work in Colorado and others. It's that young people owned it, and we're empowered, we're a part of the process. So the degree to which we can kind of empower young people to lead these efforts, again, consistent effort, kind of over time, not just on the cycle, but train these organizers to empower young people. It's something that seems to work, and again, consistent with what people tell us should work through our research. And the same thing goes, I think, for school administrators as well as teachers, especially those who don't have any particular profile around student engagement, but to encourage young people, encourage teachers and administrators to kind of encourage participation and organize and fund these activities kind of throughout the year, just not on those cycles. We talked about, I think what's critical to making these next steps happen is once we have this leadership is to emphasize local issues that people care about. This is the opportunity that I think we have, and we've seen this increase on a national basis before Parkland, but what Parkland is able to do is it's making politics relevant for a generation of young people because they can see the tangible effects of a ban or not a ban, a bump stock, ban or not. And that same approach can happen in every community across America. We heard a terrific case study from Chicago, people organizing to remove a local prosecutor from office. So all politics is local, but especially in terms of talking about the kind of the tangible effects. I think it just kind of accelerates the overall mood that's happening. In terms of immediate next steps, there's a terrific, you mentioned several times, your Times piece written a couple of months ago, I think, which highlighted kind of the best practices from several universities and colleges across the country. Is begin to circulate and facilitate that, which reminds people of the good work that is already happening and the ways in which others can kind of improve it, and to keep some pressure on universities and colleges to also kind of release the NSOLV numbers and reports to make sure that they're held accountable for their own campuses, of course, including ours. In terms of some of the big challenges, of course, the funding, year-round funding, not just during election years. And I'd just like to add, I think the overall lack of institutional trust that this generation has in almost all the levers of power, other than college administrators. College administrators were 61% in our last poll indicated they trust college administration. 61%. Higher than the military, which is always to the top of 51%. But the presidency, Congress, federal government, et cetera, kind of in the low 20s, teens, media, Wall Street. So I think this is a pragmatism that's happening where folks do want to kind of partner with their administrations to further move this forward. And the last example, just in terms of, I think there's a lot of data that's in existence, as I mentioned before, and we should, especially kind of folks on our panel, there were some case studies. In Colorado, we went from 60% to 80% turnout, which is worth looking at, and that's a degree to which people have invested longer term, and not just happening, it took several years to get there. So with that, thank you very much.
Okay, Angeli Fernandez from the Leading the Way Technology and Social Media.
Great, hello. So my name is Anjali, and I am not Nico, who facilitated a wonderful conversation with Victoria, Jason, and Crystal from Tumblr, Google, and Facebook, respectively. And I think one of the main themes about our conversation is that you have these tech companies that are, in general, either focused on building communities online or increasing access to information. And so how can we take these methods and these things that are happening online and translate that into actual action offline? Granted, tech and social media is something that is a hot topic of sorts right now, perhaps not for the best reasons. And so a common theme that came up was how do we minimize the creep factor, one would say, of using technology in ways that may or may not necessarily be welcomed automatically in ways that it might have been before. So I'm going to share 4 main readouts from this and kind of delineate what we kind of talked about. The first is something that was echoed previously, increasing access to voter registration, making that happen online. That's something that Wendy and Ashley all mentioned already. Being able to have increased access to voter registration, particularly things that are mobile friendly, because as we discussed, low-income communities particularly use mobile research and access the internet on mobile apps. And so that's a limiting factor for people who are able to access voter registration. Second, we want to increase investment in education. That's education of 2 types. One is voter education and also technical literacy for people on the other side. So we talked about having this interested bystander phenomenon where people understand that it's important to participate in elections, but not necessarily understanding how their issues relate to them directly, and maybe don't understand the scope of how those elections that aren't the presidential election impact their day-to-day lives. And perhaps there's a way for tech companies such as Google and Facebook to increase engagement through methods such as showing more relevant information in news feeds or things like that to help people understand the impact of an election in their day-to-day lives. On the flip side, technical literacy for decision makers is important because increasingly, as we heard from Crystal at Facebook, people who use social media on the political side are now wary that the engagement that they're receiving from people who might be constituents, well, maybe that's all bots. They don't know. We've transitioned from a phase of embracing social media and technology to maybe being more wary of it. And so while that is an opportunity to start a conversation, it's important to use that as an opportunity to educate people about what is possible through technology. there's also a lot of really low-hanging fruit that's available that a lot of organizations just aren't taking advantage of. For example, basic search engine optimization. When I Google voter turnout, what shows up? Google has done a great job of promoting that information in certain cards that are facilitated and propagated to the top of your search timeline, but that's not necessarily something that organizations on the other side that promote voter turnout on their own are optimizing themselves. So how can tech companies make people more aware about the tools that they are building that can be used to increase voter participation? Along those lines, a third thing that might be really important and possibly really simple is creating a common data format, or actually using a common data format for information about elections and voter registration. In order for any kind of tech company to use and promote information about registration, deadlines, election issue information, it has to be accessible. And that means that it needs to be available online in a structured format that can be scraped. And so a takeaway for that would be maybe providing resources for local organizations and developers to put a few hours into making their data available in a structured format so that it can be accessible to any major tech company. And finally, one of the most important takeaways I'd say is just the ability to have a conversation with people who are like-minded across disciplines. You know, this conversation that we had across the hall is, for many people, one of the only times that they're in the same room with technologists, voter activists, and academics all in the same place. There are some nonprofits where there are executive boards that bring these kinds of people together, but those are silos of information. And so what kind of way can we create a working group or some kind of table to share best practices across tech companies that allows us to really share what's happening and communicate effectively and divide up work across groups in order to specialize towards what companies are most catered towards doing. So all that aside, it's important to note, and I think Jason brought this up in our conversation, that there are things that are happening online that translate to offline, and we can't forget that there are some people who, in countries that have national holidays for voting, and they have time off from their jobs to be able to actually go and do things. And so technology is just a means to an end for actual legislative change and policy changes that can help make people's lives easier to vote. But that being said, these are tools that can be used to increase access to information and perhaps spur people to go out and participate in elections.
And Sayu Bojwani from the Universal Registration for Voting.
Great, thank you. So I get to have the pleasure or burden of being last. And so I'll try to, mention things that weren't already mentioned. My panel was facilitated by Miles, and perhaps because of that, or in spite of that, we were a kind of abstract postmodern interpretation of universal voting. Tom Hicks, Clarissa Martinez de Castro, and Wendy Weiser were my fellow panelists. I'll share, let's say, 4 or 5 things that came up that I think haven't been addressed already. And one of them is the idea of thinking about voting and voter participation as a means to an end, and that if we want to mobilize larger numbers of voters, that we really have to be able to engage folks around the purpose of voting rather than just the simple act of voting. We talked a lot about the idea of creating community and that recreating that sense of community that once existed, whether that's through dinner conversations with mail-in ballots or getting folks to the polls in community. We also talked a lot about the high school and college as a site for engagement, in particular thinking about things like registering folks at the age of 16 in advance of their qualification for voting, but also lowering the voting age. And Clarissa mentioned the importance of the high school site alongside teachers as trusted messengers for engaging particularly Latino students and other students of color and immigrant students. And then we talked also about this notion of participation as a kind of something that is broader than voting. So how do we seed the ground for perhaps an eventual policy of universal voting by engaging non-citizens in public financing, by engaging them in participatory budgeting, and just kind of broadening our notion of participation so that voting becomes part of a continuum rather than a beginning or an end to participation. A couple of other things I'll mention is that in order to get to this place, I think one very obvious thing is that we have to redefine our norms around participation, right? This entire day has been built around universal vote, or around voting, and so there's obviously a mandate to rethink participation before we can even go, before we can really even have a conversation about voting as only one aspect of participation. I think we have to think about it also from the standpoint of the voter experience and not just about policies and structures. And then we have to think about voting in the context of changing lifestyles. So tech has come up a lot. We talked about the DMV and about post offices and ways that those as institutions whose needs and purposes are adapting over time, how those can serve as centers or levers for engaging voters. But the larger theme there was really about how do we rethink it, right? So in a moment when we might have more autonomously driving vehicles, or fewer young people are getting driver's licenses, what does automated voter registration mean through the DMV, right? And so I think that I want to end on that point because I think it's really at least what I am interpreting from our conversation is that if we are going to create the kind of change that I think many of us in this room want, and certainly the folks in our panel want, for a truly inclusive, robust, multiracial democracy, we have to move with the times, and the times are moving quite fast. So as we even as we are thinking about new policies, we have to think about how the context is going to change by the time that policy gets implemented.
So first, I want to thank all for reporting in. It's a difficult task to do. Second, we're going to give, in about 10, 12 minutes, we're going to give Miles and Teresa the last word to sum up. But we do have a brief moment, and for once, we're not going to ask for questions, we're going to ask for comments. In the sense that, John made the point that his poll says that we are facing a once-in-a-generation shift of interest in the political process. And I think that the discussion in this room and in this conference suggests that this is not just among young people, this is more broadly in this country. We are facing a shift in interest in the political process. And the big issue is how to best take advantage of it. And I just want to make sure that we open it up for anything we may have missed, or for people to comment on these same questions that we asked the reporters to comment on. What would winning look like in 5 or 10 years, or maybe in 1 year? So let me open it up to the rest of you for some final comments, things that you think maybe got left out. Yes.
Sure. So I think this is all awesome. This is a really great event. I really appreciate everybody putting it on. I think the one place where I'd be really excited for this kind of space to grow would be around really thinking about our user experience, I guess is one way to put it, for local leaders. So like a lot of folks in this room, myself included, have like laser focused on like hyper niche national problems. How do you like David spent like 15 years matching up voting records with death records, people, things like that are really specific, and that's great. But the problem is that if you're maybe, I'm sorry if I miss, that's right.
Sadly, that's part of it.
I love it. But if you're like a local leader in like Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and you want to make your election administration better, you want to have civics education in your high schools, you want to have your colleges measure their voting rates, you want to do all that, you need to have like 25 different partnerships with all of us, and that's not actually feasible for local people, and we're not bottom lining like a single relationship with people who are doing amazing things to try to make a change. So I think like, how do we all work together to not duplicate in our relationships with these folks, and and bottom line, just a better user experience for them is kind of the next big frontier.
Just here and then that. And try to start talking.
Yeah, I don't really need a mic, but I'll wait till it gets here. The one comment we often hear is that people don't vote because they're not asked. I think we need to ask them. I think that we need to remember that deciding to vote is very different from having voted. So this uptick in interest, we have to go. Remember my friend from Farmer, we got to turn that get out into a vote. And remember that the state and local election officials you work with, Archon at the very beginning talked about how creativity is the opposite of cynicism. I know my friends in the tech community talk about how creativity loves constraint. If that's true, then your election officials are some of the most creative people there are out there because it is incredibly constrained. But you would be amazed at the can do and will do and get her done at the election officials out there. So make sure you are talking to election officials and not about them, and make sure that you are talking to voters, both ones who have already voted or might vote, and make sure, as Secretary Simon from Minnesota said, that they are not just interested in voting, but are actually prepared to be a voter on or before Election Day.
Yeah, I wanted to mention something I said a little bit briefly in one of the sessions. I think one of the things we focus a lot on here, it's been terrific, I really enjoyed this, is about increasing almost the supply of the opportunity to vote, whereas we need to maybe also look at the demand for that opportunity to vote. We see these large spikes cyclically where people see the need to get out there and vote. And I'm not sure how we do that if we keep increasing the supply, whether the demand will be there after these elections or it will tail off. Charlene Carruthers actually had the best quote I heard on this little piece of it, which was, she said we need to lead with the issues, not duty and responsibility, that's not receptive in the community that she operates in. And I don't know how we do that on an ongoing basis, and I think it would be an interesting thing to look into a little.
So in addition to asking people to vote, I do want to put a marker down on the need to give them something to vote for, and that requires parties to be, and more parties. You know, someone recently described American democracy as like an old Soviet supermarket with like 2 products that are expensive. We can do better than that, and so we need to think about what are the organizational forms, including parties, because you can't have a healthy democracy without healthy parties. So just add that to the, ask people to vote, but make sure we give them something to vote for.
Sorry, I can yell really loud. So I just want to underscore one thing that I think people have been saying, but perhaps not stressing enough. And that is, I'm not convinced that the goal is 90%. I think we need to be thinking about political, or 80%. I think we need to be thinking about political equity. And, you know, there's a difference between equality and equity. You know, equality, you float the boat up for everybody. And equity, you bring up you raise the voting rates, for example, for low propensity voters and historically and currently underrepresented groups. And so I'd like to think about switching the framing from let's get everybody out to vote to what somebody said about if we work on the margins, then the people in the middle will be affected. So that's one thing I would like to stress. And then the other thing is our research on college campuses is consistent with what people have said about issues. But what students really love is they love to talk about these things. They like controversial issue discussions. And they like the ones that are about the issues they care about. And so I think that is consistent with what we've been hearing throughout, but really getting people And this is a great way to engage the community too. You don't have to just have conversations on campus, you can have them involving the local community. And I think that if you focus on that and also increasing the voting rates for low propensity voters, I think that would be two pretty noble tasks.
And I just want to piggyback on sort of the last two comments. I think especially with the idea of equity when you're talking about communities that are normally not asked to vote, making sure that we're engaging with them, but then the organizer in me, which I'm sure a lot of people here organizers are harder, is saying, then don't leave. What we do often is we go in, we put in a lot of efforts for the midterms, for the general election, and then we leave. And I think really making sure that that's part of the conversation, not only in our own organizations, but also where the money is coming from. Making sure that funders understand that you can't just put in money now and then step away. The only way to actually affect change and really see results is for that money to continue being there so that you can continue with the programs. And that's something that I heard a lot in the conversations, but I really wanted to emphasize, is making sure that we're not just going in and stepping out, but we're actually staying.
So we're going to have this be the last comment.
Great. So money has come up a lot, funding being a constraint on a lot of great interventions. I think there's one implicit assumption, and that I think is pernicious, and that assumption is that we need an impending election, and we need to be able to email someone every day saying that we're behind on our deadline in order to raise the type of money that campaigns use. And I think challenging that assumption, I think, can unlock a lot of new potential interventions that are just not feasible right now, given the timing of when funding comes.
On that note, we're going to turn it over to
Thank you, Catherine. And so for our last section, helping us do some wrap-ups and what some great energies that are being put forward around this space, I want to invite Kate Contreras with the Democracy Fund. And then Miles, do you want to also join her?
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to the Kennedy School for just a fantastic day. By way of introduction, my name is Kate Fronteira, and I work as an ethnographer and strategist. So I work as an applied researcher with different organizations working in the public interest around making our civic life more inclusive and more meaningful. I'm a proud alumna of the Kennedy School. Actually, Archon was my advisor when I was here. And Democracy Works, which is the organization that has come up a few times today, as Archon mentioned, is the sort of originator of this challenge to get to 80%, was also formed here at the Kennedy School by some colleagues of my class, and has become kind of one of the anchor organizations within the civic technology infrastructure. So the Kennedy School has a real stake in this issue, and I wanted to emphasize that. So, and my approach to research is very cross-disciplinary, centered around sort of relationship building to build a deep understanding of a particular topic. I've done work to understand America's interested bystanders with Google and the Knight Foundation. I also just published a book of 27 stories about what it's really like to breastfeed and pump in the United States. So my work kind of goes all over the place. What I do is a little bit different. And we're hoping to bring some of that spirit to the conversation. So to sort of reiterate the challenge as it was issued, the goal would be to get 80% of eligible voters voting by 2024. In other words, a 20 percentage point increase across all elections within that 6 to 7 year period of time. And what lies beneath that goal is a goal around civic capacity building and civic power building between elections. In terms of deep and broad participation in a transformative way, such that 80% is a result of that. Importantly, as we've been framing this democracy moonshot, one of its goals is a representative electorate, one that reflects the population by demographics. So if we get more older white people voting in 80%, that doesn't actually meet the goal that we hold. We hold a representative electorate as a goal. And that really means a concerted focus on equity gaps in participation, to your point earlier, including people that have historically been ignored by candidates and by campaigns. To be specific, younger people, people from low income or low education backgrounds, people of color, particularly from Hispanic and Asian American communities, people serving our country or living overseas, people with disabilities, people with language access needs. This is what we're talking about when we're speaking about a representative electorate and equity. Where did this moonshot come from? So some years ago, Democracy Works convened something called the Turbo Vote Challenge. Many of you may be members of that challenge. It's largely a sort of a way to convene corporations and nonprofit organizations to serve as on-ramps for voting, and works in a kind of program-based way. Starbucks has been an anchor member of that convening and pushed the rest of the collaborative to really be thinking big, like why couldn't we get to 80% participation? So I've spent the last year with the support of the Democracy Fund thinking about how to actually make that happen beyond just it being a kind of rallying cry for organizations that are interested. How would we actually manifest that in the world? And so I've been joined in my thinking on that topic not only by my colleagues Seth Flaxman and Katie Peters and others from Democracy Works, but also Jenny Flanagan from Common Cause, Natalie Adona, Adam Ambrogi from Democracy Fund, and others. And we were able to kind of convene an early working session on this topic last fall in Cambridge that we're really honored to have Miles participate in. And in some sense, this event today is kind of one outcome of a much larger process around convening people like yourselves who care about this topic and want to see something change. So since the time in the fall, I've spent the last couple of months basically talking to everybody that will talk to me, upwards of 100 different experts in a whole variety of realms, including community mobilization, elections, technology, academia. Also done a pretty extensive research and policy review, sort of exploring what the most recent literature suggests about what works in voter engagement, and had a number of deep conversations with a variety of people about how this moonshot can be designed for equity, including in its very leadership, and instead of backcasting for equity. So thinking about those considerations from the beginning. And so just to offer a few thoughts about some early design instincts that we have developed out of all of this exploration. I want to start with process values because I think in my experience, the process of exploring a moonshot like this is just as important as the final result. I think as from a starting point that the work does need to be nonpartisan, but not without a strong perspective. In other words, a nonpartisan approach seems fundamentally necessary, but not if it means bringing groups together that don't fundamentally share the same goal of an expanded and representative electorate. And it does mean concerted relationship building with conservative groups. I think a second process goal is that a representative electorate requires a representative leadership team for the actual initiative itself. To all of the comments about how historical context really matters, the growth of the consultant class, we want more people to show up to elections, and we take a representative sort of lens in all of that. And I think in addition, in the coming months, in addition to performing a deeper racial and socioeconomic justice analysis of this problem space and potential approaches, we want to make sure that the people who are actually doing the intellectual and creative work of figuring out the strategy come from, represent the communities that we're talking about, and have the resources to do that. So that's why I say we've developed some instincts, but by no means am I offering something that's fully baked. It really should be emergent out of the leadership team that is convened to make this thing happen. Relatedly, two other sort of process instincts that come from my friend Erhard Grave, who just defended his PhD this week, focusing on frameworks for empowerment-based design and civic technology and impact, providing opportunities for discourse and reflection. Again, the process of accomplishing an 80% representative electorate is as important as the outcome, providing opportunities for people to think and reflect throughout that process. And anticipating breakdown and evaluating rigorously. I would like to see this moonshot over the next 6 to 7 years really engage scholars and practitioners to learn from one another, learn from each other, and sort of fix things as we go on. Just a few last instincts about how this could work from the perspective of sort of strategy, like what's the there? What are we actually suggesting should happen out of all of this? Because our process has been and is going to continue to be very emergent, based on the people and organizations that say, yes, I want to be involved in leading this work. I talk about sort of strategy again in terms of instincts. So informed by the research that we're doing, but constantly iterating based on what we learn. And an important theory influencing this work is that any solution has to be intersectional. I mean that in terms of identity. I also mean it in terms of there's not one idea to get us to 80%, but a sort of layered set of ones that look through the lens of voting rights, election administration, civic tech, cultural factors. So a couple early instincts based on that understanding. I think a really important anchor of any work around this moving forward is the evidence that suggests the social relationship is a really important motivator for turnout. So there's a growing evidence base around approaches that bring to traditional voter engagement the work of building power over the long term. And traditional voter engagement is probably going to work for people who are already inclined to vote, needed the process to be a little bit easier. That work is important, it should continue. Approaches, I'm thinking here of integrated voter engagement, of deep canvassing, sociocultural cognition models of voting behavior, those kinds of approaches that are driven by social relationships, trusted local organizations, well-trained canvassers, sincere, ongoing, face-to-face interactions. All of those bring a way of engaging people who really weren't planning to participate in the process to bring it in. I also think that those approaches help connect people's interest to electoral power and address deep beliefs about efficacy and agency that are probably what we mean when we say, why don't we have a culture of voting here in the United States? So I think those are strategies that get at those deep beliefs and connect them through dynamic social relationships to actual power. There are a number of other elements of the strategy that I'm happy to sort of talk about, not the strategy, the ideas that have emerged as potential elements of a strategy that I'd be happy to talk about. I think one last thing that I really want to add to this is the way that social technologies can really powerfully amplify community-driven work. And we're at this really interesting moment in time where, and I'm not the person to say technology fixes everything, but technology could actually make, I think, a really meaningful difference to our moonshot. And we're sensing a really strong interest from a number of technology companies that want to be involved. So what's different about this moment? Our social technologies are advanced enough to perform very powerful engagement tasks. I've talked with a number of technology companies that have experimented with some combination of automated and human sort of one-to-one concierge services for voting, where I'm building a relationship with you over, let's say, Facebook Messenger. It's not the only example. And through that deep digital relationship that I'm building, I'm thinking here specifically of Push Black and Project Pulso, providing you information that helps build a relationship and then helps potentially move you into more political activities. Obviously, that's happening across a number of different platforms as well. But this political moment is putting pressure on sort of everybody to react. So I'd like to see, based on the evidence around the importance of building a strong relationship with somebody based around issues that they care about, trusted local organizations, when down the line is it possible and appropriate to use a technology. There are other elements of the strategy that are there, but we're coming to time. So just to wrap up, just to share sort of our next steps here, it's our goal over the next coming months to really build a representative leadership collaborative around this idea. My goal is to work myself out of a job and to continue to do further exploratory work that needs to be done, ideally so that we can try and launch this moonshot by the end of 2018. I'm very eager to be reinforced in a lot of my beliefs and challenged in my beliefs from this conversation today. If there are folks here who have questions about this initiative, I unfortunately have to catch a flight, but Jenny, Natalie, and Adam are here to be able to talk with you. In particular, would be interested in speaking with people who represent a community or a series of communities that are more represented in the population than they are in the electorate, and for whom this initiative is aligned with the goals that they have for the work that they do. But anyway, just to close with a thanking to Miles and to Archon and to everybody here at the Ashland and Kennedy School for helping us think about this topic in a really meaningful way. So thank you.
Kay, I want to thank you and do a double homage in a way, which is that it's absolutely the case that the theme for today's conference came from the work that the Moonshot is doing. I was in favor of 95% participation, but I got talked down to 80 thanks to all the work that you've done. And secondly, we absolutely look forward to working with you and being, as I said to Jenny, kind of a tributary to the work that you're doing through this conference and work that we'll do in the future. So I also want to do just a couple of very quick thank yous to the ASH team. They have been great to work with putting this together, and particularly to Teresa Acuna, my main colleague in putting this together, and to Archon Fung, who has been just totally on board on this today's work and all the work that we're doing. I think it's been a great day of discussion, at least I think so. I think it's been really, really good energy and really good thinking as I've listened to both in the sessions that I attended and also in the conversations. And I hope it certainly stretched my thinking, and I hope it stretched yours. We had, I would say, 4 goals for today's conference. One, to assemble a really, really good group of people, utilizing, sort of Harvard's convening power, if we can say that, to really bring a lot of people together from the practitioner world, from the academic world, from the election officials world, to really talk these things through, and to make connections among you that will go forward into the work you do. I think we have to be completely aware and candid that we need to continue to broaden out the kinds of people who are in the conversation. We worked to do that today. We made some progress, but it's an ongoing issue to make sure that we have the broadest possible, and I echo what Kate just said about that as well. Second goal was to get the group to stretch collectively, to posit the assumption that we all think that getting to 80% and a representative electorate is important, and we can do it together. We may come with different points of view, we may come with different perspectives, but I think the actual idea was to just get us to really think further together. And I think we will have, by the way, a set of proceedings that kind of capture and catalog all of the ideas that were generated today, and I think it was a lot. The third is to help shape the work of the Harvard Kennedy School going forward. We clearly want to continue this work. Making democracy work is one of the major themes of the Kennedy School, not only this year, but ongoing. And I think I'll come back to that in a minute. And then fourth, we want to contribute to the work ahead in making our democracy all that it can be, a vibrant, inclusive, representative, participatory community and democracy. So those were the 4 goals. I think it's safe to say that we've succeeded in goal number 1 and goal number 2. I think it was an extraordinary group of people. I joke with people that many conferences that I go to, I know about 90%, at least 80% of the people, as we say. Not so today. This is a really different group of people, many of whom know each other, but many of whom don't. And I think it was great, and I think that I could watch kind of different kinds of interactions taking place. And I think we will all, when we see the proceedings, that will even help further. So on the second one, we actually did, I think, really, really great thinking. I heard some ideas that I hadn't heard before that I certainly want to continue to work on. I think that was true for most of you, so I think that's a really good plus. And I think, as I sometimes say, nothing you do is wasted. The ideas that you got here today will go with you. So those are the first 2 purposes. The third is to, inform the Kennedy School's work going forward. Actually, the truth is, and for some of you this may be new, there's a tremendous amount of work on these democracy issues that's going on throughout the Kennedy School, not just at the Ash Center. Belfer Center, as some of you know, is doing a tremendous amount of work on cybersecurity and elections, working with local officials and state election officials. The Shorenstein Center is doing great work on fake news, on media bias, on different ways in which our democracy is being distorted in and around the media environment. The Institute of Politics has always been and continues to be kind of the premier site for the sharing of wisdom from political practitioners. You can go to the JFK Forum almost any night of the week and hear things that are terrific. And I think that they will continue to do that, and I think that's a great service. So every part of the Kennedy School is involved in this. But in terms of for the Ash Center, I think building participation is really a key goal for us. You heard this morning Archon say that the Kennedy School is joining the University of Michigan and others in the 90% challenge. I think that's fabulous. I think it's going to be serious work. I know Teresa's going to be leading the Air Center's work on it, and I think it's great. I certainly intend to continue to work on the concept of universal voting, whether that's compulsory or incentivized or whatever it is, but this is an idea that deserves some discussion, and why not have the Kennedy School be the place where that takes place. We are certainly going to continue to bring scholars and practitioners together. I think that was one of the purposes of today's event and other events that we have done and that are already in planning stage for next year. We will do that in a general way, that is in a large scale way, as in today, but also in a more specified single collaboration on different things. So being a convener in this work is certainly something that we intend to do. We also want to lift up the work that so many of you are doing. You heard about the moonshot, but I heard from organizations that are doing extraordinary work in the field of including participation, motivating young people, etc. So we're not going to reinvent the wheel, but we are certainly going to try to lift up the work that other people are doing. In terms of the fourth goal, I think time will tell. There's definitely a desire. So this has already informed and will continue to inform the work that the Kennedy School is doing. In terms of contributing to the goals that we set, democracy's challenges are big. We plan to engage with you on an ongoing basis. The challenge to getting 80% is not, just a single, it's not a path to it. It's an ecosystem that needs to be dealt with on all kinds of levels. Whether it's eliminating the pernicious influence of big money in our politics, that helps to contribute to 80%. Entering gerrymandering so that there is actually contested elections everywhere is a part of it. Overcoming the bitter polarization that we have in the country, again, is a part of it. All of these things contribute to the challenge, the daunting challenge that we face, and all of them are doing it. Let me just make two observations that are sort of been percolating around, or on things that have been percolating around. First of all, you can really get discouraged if you start going on you think if we just have universal registration, that'll solve the problem. But why should just letting people have more access to voting doesn't help if they don't have anything to vote for? And you can't really expect that people are going to vote if money dominates the elections and there are no candidates because the gerrymanders. And so it can become a kind of a daunting cycle. But that can't be, and yes, that's true. I can go to bed at night and think that way if I want to. But I don't think that absolves us of the responsibility to try to break that cycle in whatever ways we can do it, whether you're working on money in politics, whether you're working on voting participation, whether you're working on registration, whether you're working on young people, whether you're on college campus work. All of those things contribute to the challenge that we face, and therefore all of them need to be worked at and contribute to the solution. The second observation I would comment on is that, people have said, we're living in really perilous times. This is sort of like a little bit of a kumbaya conference and saying we're all together and we want to get to 80% representative participation, and we do, but there are enemies out there. There are people who are trying to prevent us from doing that. We would be foolish not to recognize that, obviously. So I strongly encourage those of you who are working on elections, working on ballot initiatives, worked on legislative fights, working on fighting back against voter suppression. All these things need to be done. But at the same time that we are engaged in the day-to-day battle, I sort of think we have to step back and look forward to say, what is it aspirationally that we would like? And that really was what we tried to do today. So we are by no means ignorant of the idea that there are fights to be had and that there are people out there who have a different view. But I think that all of us need to keep in mind that there is something that we want to aspire to, and that is a truly vibrant and inclusive democracy. So while we're fighting the day-to-day battles, I think keeping that goal in mind aspirationally, I think is really important. So we thought today was a way to do that. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that you found it useful. Thank you very much again for all being here, and let's go have a drink together. Thank you very much.